Okay, we're going to start the recording.
A few names that I need to send you that wanted the recording.
Say it again.
I have a few names of people that I need to send you that
Okay.
want the recording.
Okay.
It's only like 3 people.
Okay, sweet. And I have a few folks who are going to reach out as well. Yep.
And we plan on sending out the presentation to the people who showed up Monday and yesterday.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Tony will do his group and will do his group.
Okay, so in the chat, I let everybody know that I have muted everyone just so we don't have any background noise coming in. When we have our session breaks, I'm going to open that back up so everybody can ask questions if they'd like. And we'll also open it back up when we have our questions towards the end of tonight's session. So if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to put them in the chat, and we will hopefully be able to see them in time if you have some. We'll give everybody about 3 more minutes to get into the session. About another minute here before we get started. Let some people trickle in. Nice. Okay. All right. I see that we are at 6:30, so we're going to get things started. For folks who weren't in just a few minutes ago, we currently have everybody muted just so we don't have any background information coming in or background noise coming in from everybody's microphones. But during our breaks that we'll have 2 to 3 breaks scheduled throughout the entire session. So those will each be about 5 minutes long, but we're going to open it up and make sure everybody can have a chance to unmute themselves during that time period to ask any questions. But if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to put them in the chat, and that'll be kind of our main mode of communication here. But my name is Shane Bainey. I am the new wildlife conservation analyst with the Baltimore City Parks and Rec Department, and I'm helping coordinate our new deer management program that we just got established back in January. So tonight's online session, bear with us as we deal with some technical issues that might arise, but I'm hoping that everyone is able to view the presentation just fine right now. If you have any questions for us, like I said, throw them in the chat, but if you would like to email us later, our program's email is listed right here on the bottom of the screen, and that's deer.program@baltimorecity.gov. And before we get into tonight's presentation, I want to do a little introductory script that I have here that establishes some ground rules for us. So in tonight's presentation, we're going to learn about several topics related to community deer management. We will discuss what our program is all about, provide information about deer biology, introduce residents to what community deer management is, teach folks about deer management techniques, and explain the framework that our program is going to use to make deer management decisions in the city of Baltimore. Community deer management can be a controversial topic that is often accompanied by resident disagreements and heightened emotions that ultimately lead to unconstructive conversations. Knowing this, I'd like to establish some ground rules before we begin tonight's presentation. We ask each of tonight's attendees to make a sincere effort to listen to understand, to be respectful of those with differing views, and to not argue or disrupt with fellow attendees or the presenter. If disruptions do arise, we will reestablish these ground rules and encourage those with remaining concerns to schedule a separate meeting with myself. Save your discussion topic for our park-specific focus groups, which will be held in August, or detail your concern and place it in our little group chat that we have here, and we can take a look at that and address it later. Someone can't see the presentation. Let me get out of this presentation mode then. Stop sharing.
I can see it fine, Shane.
Okay. There is somebody in here who's not able to see it. A couple people said it. Okay. Let me stop presenting quick, and then I'll reopen it back up. Okay. Give me just a moment. Okay, I'm hoping now everyone is able to see the content. Andrew, I'm seeing you shake your head no. So some people are and some people aren't. I wonder if that's just a display setting for some folks. Okay, so Tammy is helping us here, and she said that for some folks who weren't able to see it initially, there was a small icon in the corner of the screen that you had to click in order to open it up. So I'm wondering if that's something that can help some folks. Private partnership to accomplish. Give us just a second here, everyone. Yep. All the other computers are muted, correct? Okay. What I'm gonna try to do, just to get around the presentation issue. Let's see here. Why can I not attach?
Put it in the chat.
Yep, I was just gonna take our PDF and throw it in the chat.
Yeah. You can follow along at home.
Yep. But my ability to put something in the chat is not showing up for right now. Give me just a second. This makes any difference. Okay, Tammy, I need your help on this. Okay, so what we're going to try to do is, instead of having the presentation displayed, we're also going to put the PDF version in the chat. And we're trying to get that done right now. I'm not able to attach it right now on my end, but Tammy's going to try it. Okay. Well, while we're figuring that out, I'll get the rest of this portion talked about. So other deer management programs exist in our area, including one in Montgomery County, Baltimore County, and Anne Arundel County, just to name a few. Existing programs like these serve as case studies in community deer management, and we have learned about their successes and shortcomings. Our deer management team will pair these lessons with current scientific research to make a concerted effort in making well-informed management decisions for deer management in the city of Baltimore. I would like to acknowledge that no deer management decisions have been made at this time. Those decisions will be made using expert input, community leaders' input, and public input, some of which we will be collecting here this evening with you guys. Additionally, I want to highlight that I do not have a vested interest in the city's deer management decisions. I have a vested interest in the process that we use to come to those decisions. Tonight, we invite you to build on your community deer management knowledge, and we hope that you will gain an appreciation for the intricate nature of deer management in Baltimore. So if we have two folks who are willing to put in the chat what kind of brought you to this session. So go in the chat and type in your answer there, and we'll see what folks are coming to the session to learn about.
This.
Is the chat enabled? Because when I go to chat, I'm not given a box where I can type it.
Okay. It should be. I don't know why we're having all these issues here. Meeting options.
And it may just be me. I'm not sure.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know, though.
It's enabled.
Yes, Tony?
You can use, people can use the chat. I mean, it's
Okay.
enabled.
Okay. And so I have it set to where it's supposed to mute folks, but it still, some people are able to do it.
Meetings.
I don't know. Participation. Let's do this. Meeting chat is on, so you should be able to see that. Okay, that's in the settings. That's good to go. Okay. Everything else should be good here. Tammy, were you able to put the presentation in there? Can't attach it. Okay. Okay, so we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. I'm hoping that some folks are able to see the presentation on the screen. We're trying to problem shoot on the back end. We have some other folks here trying to help us out get that PDF put into the group chat. But in looking at some of our reasons why folks are here, we see dead deer on the roadways, ticks and Lyme disease. We have seen many injured as a concern. Okay, so if everyone can keep their mics muted, I think that would help with some of the echo that we're having. Okay, so let's get into the first part. So again, my name is Shane Bainey. I am the Wildlife Conservation Analyst with the Baltimore City Parks and Rec. I just got done with my graduate program down at the University of Georgia, and we were specifically working on an urban deer management project. And part of the framework that we're using here in the city is the framework that I created during my grad project. Before that, I got my undergraduate degree at the University of Minnesota in natural resources management and specifically in wildlife management and ecological restoration. So both of those two realms kind of fixed together here with considerations for urban deer management. So this evening, we're going to be talking about deer biology. We'll be discussing what our program is all about, why we got it established in the first place, and we're also going to detail some of the steps that we're taking in creating our decision-making framework. Then we'll give education to everyone in attendance this evening about each deer management technique that we're looking at and considering in this framework. And lastly, we'll get input from you guys on your support and perceived effectiveness of each of those management techniques, utilizing the education that we're providing here this evening. So the first topic that we'll talk about is deer biology. And when we talk about biology, we're looking at things like behavior, diet, reproduction, all that good stuff. So the first topic that we'll talk about with deer biology is the general names or nomenclature for white-tailed deer. So the female deer, those are known as does. This might be unsurprising to some folks, but other folks may not have been exposed to this information yet. And then for our male deer, we have, or we call them a buck, and they have antlers. So these little antler protrusions on the top of the head, those are the antlers. And at this time of year, you're seeing them with a velvet, which is living tissue on those antlers as they continue to grow. But later on in this fall, you see that live tissue start to shed off as they expose the bone underneath. And then both the does and the bucks create our young, or the fawns. So you've probably been seeing a few of these running around Baltimore, and hopefully none of them have been hit on the roads. But they do tend to run around quite a bit with their mothers after about a 3-week period after they're just born. But those are some of the names that we have for white-tailed deer. Now, as for diet, normally they are what we call a generalist species. So they're able to consume pretty much anything with certainly a few exceptions. But most of the time they're focusing on things like berries and nuts. So we think of things like oak acorns. We're looking at hickory nuts. But then they also focus on eating large or broadleaf plants, which are known as forbs. And we think of things like hostas or other things that we might have in our garden that are really broadleaf plants they like to eat. They're also known as a browsing species, so they'll eat twigs. So we're looking at oak tree twigs. We're looking at maple tree twigs, willow tree twigs, and everything in between. But on the don't like side of thing for their diet, we're looking at grasses mostly is in their diet as a don't like type food. And the picture that I have here for our grasses, that is a species known as Japanese stiltgrass, which is a non-native invasive plant that has been taking over a lot of our forest understories. So they try to avoid eating that type of plant. And then we also have other plants that have, deterrents on them. And in this case that I have with the picture here, we have thorns on this. So this is invasive plant known as wineberry. So they don't like to eat those, of course, because it hurts their tongue whenever they put it in their mouth. And they also don't like a few other species, either because they are low in calories, they might have a bitter taste to them, and other things that might deter them from eating them. But we're looking at things like American beech, some other species that come to mind. Let's see. Pawpaw leaves they don't like, and there's a few other species that they prefer not to eat. But that gives you a general idea about what some of their diet consists of. So now, where do they end up living? Like their diet, they're kind of a general species on where they live. Of course, they aren't living in our downtown Baltimore areas because they certainly don't have any food availability down there. And it's really tricky for them to get away from, cars and humans and everything else in between. And then, of course, they aren't living in the water either. So we find them anywhere from that suburban zone all the way out to the rural areas. And they utilize these spaces mostly on these edge habitats where it goes a transition from forest out to like something like a lawn area or a parking lot. But on that edge transition, you oftentimes see really nutritious plants growing in there that they really like to eat. So in our suburban settings, you might think, well, Shane, there's probably not a lot of food there for them, but in actuality, there is, because we have a lot of really nutritious landscaping and garden plants that help them thrive. And they also have the backyard bird feeders and corn piles that folks put out in their backyards, which is really attractive to a lot of deer as well. Now, as for urban deer home ranges, in the rural settings, we're seeing about 1 square mile, so about 640 acres is their home range. But on the smaller end in urban zones, we see about 62 acres being the size for home ranges for does in the springtime when they have their fawns. So this picture here that I have is of Patterson Park. And when we look at 62 acres in Patterson Park, it's about half of that park. So that gives you a good inclination for how large 62 acres is. Now, on the larger end, we're looking at something closer to about 884 acres. And again, 1 square mile is 640 acres. So we're a little bit over that. But the picture that I have here on the right-hand side, this is of Gwynns Falls Leakin Park, which is about 930 acres. So, of course, 884 acres takes up the majority of that space. So that gives you a good inclination about how, variable some of their home ranges can be in our urban settings. As for reproduction, we typically see bucks breeding does in the last 2 weeks of October all the way through the end of December. And if they aren't bred on the earlier side of the season, they'll come back into estrus or into heat later on after about 28 days, and then they'll see if they can get bred on that second instance. And after about 200 days, those does that are getting bred by those bucks they're going to have their fawns. And typically we're seeing that happening in the May to June timeframe. So we're a little bit outside of that right now. And if you take a walk out in the woods, you'll see a lot of larger fawns starting to run around. But twins is most common for white-tailed deer. If they don't have enough forage or they aren't doing super well body condition wise, they might only have a single fawn. But we've seen instances where they've had quadruplets as well. So sometimes it's a little bit higher than just 2 or 1. Now, I also wanted to talk about diseases. Diseases is a really big thing that we need to consider when it comes to urban deer management. And here, the link that I have is for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. They have a really good resource listing out all the different types of diseases that white-tailed deer face. But I did want to note a few top ones kind of at the top of my list for our program to consider. The first one is a disease known as chronic wasting disease. This is a neurological condition that is caused by a misshapen protein called a prion. And this is 100% fatal in any white-tailed deer that gets chronic wasting disease, or CWD. And this eventually causes ulcers in the brain, and eventually body condition decreases to a point where they eventually die off of that. And this was initially found in Colorado and has spread since throughout the United States. And we had our first case of chronic wasting disease in Baltimore County last year. So sooner or later, it is going to be part of the Baltimore City deer population, which is concerning. The second disease that I wanted to note was epizootic hemorrhagic disease, or shortly known as EHD. This is where ulcers are being caused just a moment here. Steve, if you're able to unshare your screen.
I was just testing to see if I could get it to share because I think most of us aren't seeing whatever you're presenting.
Okay.
So I was able to apparently successfully share, and so
okay.
just wanted to see if anything was working.
Yep. Let me bring up the presentation again. Okay. Let me get back up to our spot here. Switch back and forth on me. Okay, EHD. So this disease causes ulcers in areas such as the hard palate or the tongue, but it eventually causes hemorrhaging or internal bleeding in white-tailed deer. And oftentimes, as their body conditions start to decrease, you'll find them dead or really close to being dead near water bodies because they're trying to quench their thirst. And in some instances, you'll also see hoof sloughing. So this picture that I have here shows the keratin on deer hooves starting to come off or peel off. So that can be a telltale sign of EHD. Now, this disease is only about 25% deadly in the white-tailed deer populations that we have, so it's not as large of a concern as chronic wasting disease can be. The last disease that I want to note is, of course, Lyme disease. So this is at the forefront of a lot of folks' minds. This isn't a disease that white-tailed deer get, but they are a host to the black-legged ticks that do have and transfer that disease over to humans. So the tick itself is not causing the disease. It's a bacteria that's on the tick that is transmitted then to humans. But this is something that we're going to be taking a look at with our establishment of our program. So a little bit of population history throughout the eastern United States. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, white-tailed deer were almost completely wiped out of the eastern U.S., and that was for a couple of different reasons. The first being degradation to our forests. So lots of folks were using lumber to create homes and other structures. But then we also saw lots of hunters using and taking too many deer in the eastern United States. So they went almost nearly extinct for that time period. But as that continued on, state wildlife agencies start to recognize, we're losing our deer populations, we're losing the habitat that they really need. And then in the mid-1900s, they began reintroducing some populations back into the eastern U.S. Those populations were coming from areas like Texas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and other areas. But they also started putting in more harvest restrictions, making it so you can't go out and harvest as many deer as you want. Maybe you can only have one or two. And of course, they also focused on habitat management as well, so they can both find food resources and areas where they can reproduce and find protection. Thanks to all the efforts in the mid-1900s, we now see mostly stabilization across the United States, specifically here in the eastern U.S. And right now, Maryland sits at about 200,000 to 250,000 white-tailed deer. But we do see hot pockets of, increasing populations still of white-tailed deer, and most of those are seen in our urban spaces or suburban spaces in this case. And Baltimore is one of those spaces. So you might be wondering, well, why are there so many in some of our park areas or other green spaces that we have in our urban areas? The first reason is that they are losing some of their initial territory or range. So this picture that I have here is down in Roswell, Georgia, but a lot of these similar things are happening here in Maryland. So in 1994, we see this spot here had lots of forested area, but then development started to come into this spot, and we see things like shopping malls, homes, schools, all of the different types of infrastructure starting to really funnel into this area. So we're losing all of that green space. So when we have multiple green spaces being lost throughout the city, those deer have to go somewhere else. And they all go to the green spaces that are left. So that can really concentrate our populations. Another reason why we see white-tailed deer populations start to increase in urban settings is because they have access to really nutritious human-provided food. So think of things like landscaping and garden plants. We're looking at bird feeders, corn piles. All that stuff is really nutritious for white-tailed deer. They also aren't seeing the number of predators that they would normally have experienced historically. So back in the day, we were looking at lots of bears, mountain lions, red wolves that would have been traveling this area and really taking out a lot of white-tailed deer. But as we've continued to develop, we've lost a lot of those predators on the landscape. So now we really only have coyotes and sometimes red foxes, but typically those species are only going after fawns in the early part of the season. But the last reason that we have for why there's so many white-tailed deer in our areas is, of course, limited hunting pressure that they would normally experience in rural settings. So what is the result of having too many in our areas? We think it's very, very enjoyable to see a lot of white-tailed deer in our backyard spaces, but they do have negative impacts. And one of the first impacts that I'll note here is something called a browse line. And I have a video here. Please put in the chat if you aren't able to hear the video. On your end, you may need to turn up your volume, but it should be able to work. So let me go ahead and play that here for you guys.
Hi, I'm Shane Vaney. And today we're going to be talking about browse lines, which is something that white-tailed deer cause to some of our forests. So if you take a look at some of this area here, what you'll notice is that white-tailed deer come through these areas and they're eating everything from the forest floor up to about 4.5 feet, and sometimes they go up to about 6 feet. So if you look at this edge that I have here, you'll see all of the leaves above that 4.5 to 6 foot range are still intact, but everything below that has been eaten by white-tailed deer. So specifically on this mulberry tree, we see tons of deer browse that have been occurring on each of these branches, and all the new leaves that have sprouted this year are now being eaten off by white-tailed deer. So when we think about long-term impacts in our forests, we have to think about how much ecological damage are deer having on a lot of our tree species, and how can that impact how many young trees are able to actually grow up and actually get out of that browse line range. What we saw with the browse lines is, deer eating all the vegetation from that ground level up to about 4.5 feet. But as you can see here, there are some species growing on the ground, but one thing that you want to note is what type of species are they. So we have garlic mustard here, and we have creeping Charlie down below. I believe that's creeping Charlie anyway. But those two species are invasive plants that deer prefer not to eat. So what we see is all of the native plants that have been in this area are being browsed off, and it makes it really easy for all of these other invasive plants to come in here and actually proliferate. On a few of these branches, yeah, there's a little bit of browse happening on some of these branches, but other leaves here are within that 4.5 foot range. So they're not eating those ones, and that might be just a diet preference of some of the deer that are here. All of the native species being gone, all of these invasive species like this Japanese stiltgrass are literally creating a blanket along this entire forest floor. And when you have higher deer densities, this is kind of what the result can come out to be in some of our forests, which is alarming, and it makes a lot of work for some of our Baltimore City divisions, like the forestry division, so they have to come out here and do some invasive species work. But yeah, it's not good to see this. I'd much rather see a lot of our native plant species thriving.
As for right now, I just wanted to encourage folks to go ahead and go out to your forest and see if you can see some of those browse lines that were just talked about in that video, and see if you can notice some of those yourself. But here's a photo of a browse line that is in Druid Hill Park. This is just north of the admin building that we have, which is right over by the pool area. So we see lots of deer browse have been occurring in this area, basically creating a void of vegetation on the forest floor. We also see this in Gwynns Falls Leakin Park. This is a research plot that is used by the University of Delaware, I believe. But they've created a fence in here that deer aren't able to get inside of. So what we see on the inside of that fence is that all the vegetation is starting to recover, but on the outside of the fence, the deer are still able to browse all of the plants out there. And we can see this really stark difference between the inside versus outside of that deer exclosure. This one here is in Druid Hill Park as well. Excuse me. And this is on a decommissioned road on the, what is that, the southwestern portion of Druid Hill Park. But this tree here has been get nibbled off right at the bottom from about that 4.5 to 6 foot range. This is in Gwynns Falls Leakin Park. This is just off of Briarcliff Road, which is just up the hill from Winans Meadow. But as we can see here, very little vegetation on the forest floor. And we're seeing a lot of, if you look off into the distance, you can see that browse line at that 4.5 to 6 foot range. This particular picture is from Herring Run. And of course, this is in winter, so we aren't going to see a lot of greenery growing. But I want you to take note of all of the English ivy that is going up each tree. And you can see lines of where the deer have been browsing off all of the English ivy that have been on these trees. So we see browse lines even in the winter. The second thing that we see with having too many white-tailed deer in some of our green spaces is, of course, landscaping and garden plant damage. So here, this isn't in Baltimore City. This is just north of here across the Pennsylvania border. But this person in particular had a really nice rose garden back in the day about 3 years ago, but now the deer population has increased in their area, and so they're seeing a lot of deer-related damage. So for any folks in the group chat, let me know if you've had similar concerns or experiences with this types of damage. And you can also react up at the top. You can say, like, put a thumbs up if you've seen this type of damage occurring on your property. All right, I've seen a few come through. Great. Yeah, so that's a really popular thing. And earlier this week, we've had a few other sessions as well. So we're seeing a lot of folks who have been having an enormous amount of damage on their properties. So it's good to see that you folks are also seeing that as well. Now we also see, small saplings that are along our roads, like this peach tree here that we're getting nibbled off right on the edge of the twigs. We also see our forest restoration efforts in, this is in Powder Mill Park, where we planted tree saplings in there and put tree guards around it to try to protect the tree from buck rubbing behavior. And that buck rubbing behavior is when they are trying to shed off all that velvet that we talked about earlier. They'll rub it on trees and they'll do scent markings as well throughout the rest of the fall. But here, those bucks didn't care that those tree guards were on those saplings. So they eventually tore those off. And in the picture here on the left-hand side, it completely killed that tree. This is right over by our administration building in Druid Hill Park. Our horticulture folks came in, threw in a few plugs, and within a few hours, those deer came in and started eating off the tops of each of those plants. And before these plants were even able to establish roots into the soil, they were also yanking the entire plug out of the ground. So that's a really big concern for us as well. This is in Druid Hill Park. This is right over by the Maryland Zoo. They have a little animal hospital that's back in near the area by the Frisbee golf or the disc golf course in Druid Hill. But normally people are planting these arborvitaes or northern white cedars in these areas to provide privacy. But when we have high deer densities in these areas, you have them tearing off all of the lower parts of those trees. So it minimizes the amount of privacy that they can actually create. And this is a really, really hard browse line. So that's a really good demonstration of what that looks like. Another thing that we see with having too many white-tailed deer in our spaces is, of course, the spread of non-native invasive plants. So earlier we were talking about wineberry and Japanese stiltgrass. And this is an instance of wineberry. So this is in Druid Hill again. This is actually right over by our forestry building. But if you look over on the left-hand side of the screen here, you'll see the trees on the left-hand side have that distinct browse line at that about 4.5 foot range. And all of the native browse that would typically be in this area is now being eaten by white-tailed deer. And what's left to come in are plants that aren't being preferred by white-tailed deer. So one of them, of course, being wineberry. So that's why we see it being so successful. We also have concerns about deer vehicle collisions. We've had tons of folks let us know in our baseline questionnaire that they've had, 5 in their household that they've had in the past, or they just saw one get hit the other day. We also have folks worried about the risk of aggressive deer. So just this past November, there was a gentleman who was walking with his dog at Woodbury Park, which is on the north side of Druid Hill Park. and he ended up getting attacked by this 6-point buck that's listed here. And that was a story that was done on WBAL. So folks are, of course, concerned about the risk of aggression. And aggression doesn't need to just happen in the fall or during the breeding season. In the springtime, we'll also see aggressive does as they try to protect their fawns as well. So at this time of year, try to keep your dogs on a leash if you can. And the last concern or result of having too many white-tailed deer in our spaces is the fact that we can have disease spread. So this picture here on the bottom shows, 2 deer in one spot versus maybe 10 up to 100 deer in one spot. So let's think for a second. If we were to go into a conference room and there's only 2 people in there, the chance of one of you getting the flu from the other is pretty small. But let's say that we pack 200 of you into that exact same space. The flu or other bacteria or viruses is going to spread much more rapidly amongst yourselves. So the same thing applies for white-tailed deer in higher deer densities. So it is a big concern for folks and us and for the longevity of our deer populations. Now I've kind of demonstrated all of the negative impacts, but there certainly are positive deer impacts that I do want to note. One of the first ones, of course, being our ability to actually view them in our backyard spaces. And this might be one of the very few opportunities that our children or perhaps even ourselves have to view white-tailed deer in our backyards or in our park spaces. So it's really a treat for us to be able to see white-tailed deer still here in the city. And that's something that we, of course, want to continue. Now, when we think about the negative deer-related impacts that have been occurring across Baltimore, we have folks who have seen lots of damage, and we have other folks who maybe they haven't seen a lot of damage, or perhaps they're just really unfamiliar with deer in general. So we have this dichotomy between folks, and they can make it really, really difficult for wildlife managers such as myself to make trusted decisions, because we have folks on one end of the spectrum who really enjoy deer, they want to coexist with deer, they may be unfamiliar with deer, or they're concerned about the humaneness of management techniques. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have folks who've been having 25 years worth of damage. They're spending thousands of dollars on garden replanting every single year. Now they've grown to be intolerant of deer. They have environmental concerns about, what is the impact of having high deer densities on small mammals, amphibians, birds, everything of that nature. So we have both of these two folks fighting for making management decisions. And as a wildlife manager, we have to figure out, how do we pair those two together? So that's kind of what our program is looking at as well. Now, when it comes to actual responsibility, who does that lie on? Is it Baltimore County? Is it the state of Maryland? Is it simply the city? Or is it something that's the responsibility of residents themselves? And in all honesty, it's a mixture of everybody. So we have white-tailed deer that'll come in from Baltimore County. So what they have for management options on their end can impact the populations that come into Baltimore City. We have permitting that we can get through Maryland Department of Natural Resources, so they do have some responsibility at a state level. Our Baltimore City, they have to answer to all the concerns about residents. So they've established this deer management program now, and we have a really good opportunity to have some impacts on the high deer densities. And then, of course, as residents, we may not be able to do everything by ourselves, but we can take certain steps, such as putting tree guards around our saplings. We can put chicken wire above our lettuce patch, and we can take multiple steps, and we'll get into some of those later on in tonight's presentation. But there are ways that we can get around some of that, and we have to work together in order to make management decisions. So at this time, I'm going to give everybody a chance to go stretch your legs. We're going to take about 5 minutes, and I am going to open the chat back up for questions. So give me just a moment. I know some folks are still able to unmute themselves, but give me just a moment here, and I'm going to start my timer as well, and we'll go for 5 minutes. Okay, so let me go to settings here. Meeting options.
I'm able to write in the chat. It's been busy.
Oh, it has been, okay. So Tammy just told me that we have a lot of folks who have had some questions in the chat.
Hold them up. So.
Okay. Okay, so now I'm allowing Mike for the attendees, so we'll apply that. Okay, so let's go to, I'm just gonna pick some folks at random. I'm seeing Jacqueline Hill has her hand up. Jacqueline, do you have a question?
Jacqueline. Don't hear you.
All right, maybe she's stretching her legs. Let's go over to Kathy M. All right.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, yeah.
We still can't see about here. But several years ago, I contacted the Natural Resources Department because we just have a great number of deer. They're not afraid of anything. They jump across the road in front of cars, in front of bikes, in front of people.
Yep.
Dogs don't seem to scare them. Is there any way to control them in the city? Not now, I'm told.
Sorry, say that last part again.
I was told that at that point 2 years ago, there was no way to control them.
So there is some options that we have, and we'll be talking about each of those options. There are 9 non-lethal methods that we're going to be looking at incorporating into the framework. And then there's 3 lethal management options that we're also looking at. So we are looking into ways to do it, and there is, of course, a way that we can go about doing some control. All right, so thank you, Kathy. Let's go to some folks in the actual chat. Let me see if I can find a question. Yeah, if you want to read question.
The first one was, what is the budget for deer control?
Okay. So one of the questions that we had in the chat was, what is the budget for deer control? That would really depend on the method that we end up going with. So we have our grant that we're working underneath has about $250,000. Not all of that is going to be allocated, of course, to management. It's going to, of course, be for my salary. It's going to be for other outreach that we're doing through the next year or so. But depending on the management technique that we ultimately use, there could be funding still left for that. And we'll talk about how much some of these management techniques cost later on tonight's presentation. So I'll keep the suspense on that. But we do have funding available, and there are other resources in the city that we can potentially use as well. But we'll have to explore that later on.
Is there a public-private partnership to accomplish culling?
Okay, so the next question was, is there a public or private partnership to culling? Accomplish culling? So there are programs that are out there for culling purposes. Some municipalities or community associations will partner with the United States Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Services Division. And they can sign something called a cooperative service agreement with them, and they can come in and do some culling operations. But typically that's pretty expensive. We're looking at like upwards of like 50 grand, depending on how large the area is. But yeah, there are some partnerships that exist, especially in other municipalities that are currently doing a deer management program. Yeah, we talked about that.
Second, next question is, how can we cohabitate?
Mhm.
Having wildlife in an urban environment is special and a unique opportunity to appreciate nature and teach our youth to value the environment.
Sure. So the question that Tammy just read to me is, how can we cohabitat with deer and other wildlife for that matter? Because they are a really special thing that we get to see in our backyard spaces, and they of course have value. So there are ways to cohabitate. A lot of those are our non-lethal management options, and we'll of course detail again those later on this evening. But we can use any types of little sprays that you have for plants to keep deer away or other wildlife away from certain spots. You can go out there and try to scare them off whenever they come into your backyard. We can put up lots of fencing. But there are some pros and cons behind each of those, and some of them are more effective than others. But again, we'll go into some of that later on this evening. So we are at that 5-minute time frame. So let me go ahead and turn off everybody's mics again, see if that actually works this time. So if you have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can always look at them later and we'll address those here at the next break as well. So give me just a moment. Okay. So the next portion of tonight's presentation is, of course, talking about who we are with the Baltimore City Deer Management Program, what we've been up to, and kind of why we got established in the first place. I want to give you some context first about other deer management programs that are existing across the United States, and specifically ones that are around here as well. So we, of course, had some in Montgomery County. Baltimore County has a deer management program. Anne Arundel County has some. We're looking at programs up in Philly, Fairfax County, Virginia, Arlington, Virginia. There's some in Indianapolis, Cleveland, Ohio. We have programs down in Georgia as well. So they're kind of all over the place. And really, Baltimore City is coming in on the tail end of that. So that kind of gives us the opportunity to learn from their successes and mistakes in the past in order to make trusted decisions, make really best management practices type decisions. And it also gives us the opportunity to apply the most recent research that has been occurring throughout the United States with urban deer management. But the thing that I wanted to emphasize here is, of course, that previous deer management programs do exist. Our deer management team is not just myself. We also have a natural areas unit that has a few folks who are helping us. So we have Ashley Bowers, who is currently on maternity leave, but she is a forest expert and she's helping us with a lot of our financing type stuff. We have Megan Carr, who is a plant whiz. I was out in the forest with her today and she was like pointing at all the plants, telling me exactly what they were. So she's been able to see a lot of the damage that has been occurring to our forest understories, but very, very knowledgeable team that we have. And then for our more like public facing side, we have our marketing and communications team. And I have, of course, our community engagement team helping us here this evening as well. So really, really concerted effort among multiple departments here as well. Now, as for why did our program get started in the first place? So we were seeing lots of forest damage occurring in the past, and we have that noted in multiple forest management plans that we have for our parks. So that's really the number one thing driving our program. But we also had folks calling in saying, you know, I have garden damage every single year. I have landscaping damage every single year. Or they're calling in about disease concerns saying, my child got Lyme disease after they were out running around during recess. And, you know, how are you guys going to help address the deer related issue that we have here in Baltimore? We also have folks voicing their concerns about deer vehicle collisions. You know, we see them alongside the roads. So how can we help everybody reduce the amount of deer vehicle collisions that are occurring in the city of Baltimore? So those are just a few of the main reasons that we have for why we got our program established. And there are valuable topics that we can talk about for our urban forests. And the value for those, of course, is we're able to increase the amount of biodiversity and wildlife that can use our spaces. So our forests ultimately grow up to provide stopover habitat for migratory birds. They can eventually have cavities in them, which can have nesting structures for birds or different areas where squirrels can burrow in on a cold winter's night. So there's other areas for insects and pollinators. We have habitat for small mammals, reptiles, amphibians. So many different wildlife species utilize our forests. So we want to make sure that we have that next generation of forest plants to actually spur on those other wildlife populations and keep them being sustainable. We also see forests providing flood control. So when we have a lot of roots down in the soil, they're soaking up a lot of the rainwater that we have. So we can keep a lot of our water on the landscaping instead of having it run down our gutter system. We also, of course, see that forests can help us minimize climate change. So one of the first things, of course, being that they're able to take carbon from the air and store that in their wood fibers. But we also see the ability for them to cool down our urban zones. So if you take a look online, you can plug in, what is it called? just look up like heat maps of Baltimore, and you'll see some of the areas specifically for something like Druid Hill Park or Gwynns Falls Leakin Park, the heat in those areas is way down. So when we have really leafy neighborhoods, it has the ability to cool down our streets, cool down our homes. So that can help us with saving us on our air conditioning costs in the summertime. So there's all these different factors that we need to think about, and there's tons of value to our forests here in Baltimore City. And it's not even just the environmental type factors that we have or ecosystem values that we have. It's also values for humans themselves. As I noted earlier, we have the ability to reduce air conditioning costs in the spring and summertime, but it also helps us filter out pollutants that are in the air, which can help out with respiratory issues such as asthma. It can also boost our psychological or mental health, being able to encourage physical activity, reducing stress, lowering our blood pressure. And overall, when we have all these folks out utilizing our spaces, our green spaces, we can see improved safety because folks are able to see more crime and be able to report that more readily. And these spaces are now becoming more of a community rather than just a place where someone can go out and do something bad. And when residents are coming out to our forested areas, they get a chance to be exposed to different plants that they may not have otherwise seen. So they can also see some educational benefits as well. And then, of course, we think historically about the redlining that happened here in Baltimore back in the early 1900s that now have legacy effects to today, where we see a lot of those previously discriminated communities having a really low forest canopy. So when we want to expand our forests into other areas in the city of Baltimore, we want to think about how can we be more socially mindful on creating more forest canopy in those previously discriminated against areas. So in keeping in mind that social justice aspect of it, our program is funded through the Maryland Forest Service Community Catalyst Fund. And part of that grant requires that we go into specific areas that have seen, have historically disadvantaged communities that have that low canopy cover, the potential risk for increased climate change impacts, and a couple other classifications that we looked at with something called a climate and economic justice screening tool. So here on the map on the left-hand side, all of these highlighted yellow regions are portions of Baltimore that were highlighted as, kind of disadvantaged communities using that climate and economic justice screening tool. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to focus our investment of the deer management program into these areas to actually have some positive outcomes in these neighborhoods that may not have seen them in the past. And so we're looking at parks that are either fully encompassed by those by that classification or ones that are directly adjacent to it. So we have 8 parks that we're looking at, starting from the bottom and working our way up towards the northeast. We're looking at Fort Armistead on the south side, Faring Baybrook, Powder Mill Park, Gwynns Falls Leakin Park, Hanlon Park, Druid Hill Park, Herring Run Park, and the last one that we have is Moore's Run Park. So those are the parks that we're going to be focusing in initially with this program. And eventually, as our program gets established and hopefully we get more support, both support socially and financially, we might be able to expand it out to other zones of Baltimore that are starting to experience deer-related impacts. Now, as for activities that we've been doing since January, one of them is, of course, doing community meetings. So we've met with folks like the Friends of Gwynns Falls Leakin Park. We've met with Windsor Hill, Grove Park. What other ones have we met with? We met with the president of the Herring Run, Friends of Herring Run group. So if you're part of a community association that is interested in having folks come out and specifically me come out and provide some type of education or perhaps let you know what our program is all about, give me a holler and we can set up something. We also wanted to figure out how many deer do we actually have in our park spaces. So we wanted to do a deer count, and we have the capacity to write our own protocol, and I did that back just before March, which is when we had our count. But we initially had looked at the USDA Wildlife Services protocol for doing deer counts, and they are using thermal imaging equipment And they're also using spotlights to go through parks and count deer during evening hours. And we based all of our protocols that we created off of the thermal imaging protocols that they have. And so we purchased a thermal imaging binocular that allows us to see white-tailed deer in our park spaces. So I want to give you a taste about what we are looking at through these binoculars. See if this plays. Oh. Okay, so this video here is in Powder Mill Park. And we did this in March, so all the vegetation is not leafed out yet, so we can really have an easy time of seeing deer that are either using our athletic fields or in this case, in some of our forested areas. So we were able to count deer in each of those 8 parks. So here is what we ended up getting for that. Now, when we did these, let me tell you how we arrived at these values. So we counted deer, and then we looked at how many acres were in each of the parks that we were in, and we converted that deer per acre over to deer per square mile. So these values that I have listed here on the screen, that is the value of deer per square mile. So on the higher end, we see Powder Mill Park having 265 deer per square mile. And then on the lower end, we had Fort Armistead with only about 34 deer per square mile. So in the group chat, if anyone wants to put in a guess for what is the recommended deer per square mile value, please do that. I want to see what folks think. Okay, so I'm seeing 25, I'm seeing 30, 10. So you guys are right around it. The Maryland Department of Natural Resources recommends that we have about 20 deer per square mile. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not a magic bullet number, and you might need to have a lower deer density, and you sometimes can deal with a higher deer density. It depends on certain factors. So if we've had years and years and years worth of damage to our forest understory, that forest understory would need time to recover and actually have plants start to grow again. So on the front end, you might need to bring it down to closer to 5 to 10 deer per square mile in order to allow the forest to breathe for a bit. Now, let's say, for instance, our forest is able to come back just like that. You might be able to get by with having 25 to 30 deer per square mile. So keep that in mind as we continue to get our program established, that it is not just a magic bullet number, and we're looking on a range scale here. But in general, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources recommends about 20 deer per square mile. Now, we also took sent out our baseline questionnaire. Many of you probably have already taken that. But if you haven't had a chance to take that, that is still open up until Friday. So there's still time. So go on our website, and I'll try to post that link in the chat later on. But I wanted to share some of the results that we've gotten so far. And I do want to note that these results are preliminary, and the data that I'm going to display for you here was data that I took from July 9th. So just last week, I think, is when the 9th was. But let's get into some of that here. So the first thing that I wanted to cover was how often are residents seeing deer in Baltimore. So I want to draw your attention to the lower 3 bars here, and that's anywhere from once a week all the way to every single day. And we have hundreds of people seeing them at least once a week, and certainly some folks who are seeing them every single day. The next one that I wanted to show you was residents' experiences with deer. And as you can see here, resident experiences kind of all over the board. And that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise to folks. You know, before I was talking about folks who've seen deer damage for 25 years and they are fed up with it. But then we also have folks who really have no experience with deer, or perhaps they don't see deer all that often. So their experience might be a little bit more positive. So we're seeing that kind of displayed through the results that we've gotten through our baseline questionnaire. The next thing that I wanted to show you was respondents' desired deer population change. So how much do you want to maybe increase, or how much do you maybe want it to decrease? And here we have a lot of folks, 43%, saying that they would like the deer population to stay the same. But then on the general increase side of things, we're seeing about 9% of respondents wanting a general increase. And for the general decrease, we're looking at about 48% of respondents wanting a general decrease. Another question that we asked was, how much do you agree or disagree that forests and city parks add value to the city of Baltimore? And here it is really, really good to see that we have nearly 80% of respondents saying that forests do in fact add value to the city of Baltimore. So we're really happy with that result. We also asked residents, how much do you agree or disagree with whether Baltimore should even manage deer-related impacts? So we see a little bit more variation here, but we have about 24% of respondents saying that they were neutral on that. But we do have about 61% of folks here in the blue and yellow that are in general agreement that the city of Baltimore should do something about deer-related impacts. So it's good to see that there is a need for that based on residents' responses. Then we also asked in the baseline questionnaire, how often are different deer-related conflicts happening? And again, those deer-related conflicts can be something like bird feeder damage, forest damage, the city being slow to act on your deer-related concerns. So we asked how often those things are happening. And then we also asked, what is your tolerance for each of those deer-related conflicts? And again, this is preliminary information, but the top conflicts that we are seeing that we would need to prioritize in our management are landscaping plant damage, garden damage, the city being slow to act on your deer-related concerns, and hopefully now with the establishment of our program, we can start to more quickly address those concerns. We are seeing the need to prioritize deer vehicle collisions and how often that's happening. And the last was to deal with forest damage. So we're seeing some of that forest damage on our forest floor. And another question that we asked was, what is your level of knowledge with some different deer-related or deer management techniques? So those two categories are lethal management and non-lethal management. And I'll explain and define each of those later on. But in general, we're seeing a lot of folks saying that they have very little knowledge on either of those two types of technique categories. And so it's going to be really important for us to provide that type of education, some of which we'll be providing here this evening. But again, if you're part of a community association and you want someone to come in and provide additional education, ask us and we'll come out and do some of that. So now when we think about deer management here in the city of Baltimore, I told you earlier that we are incorporating a framework that I created during my grad program. And the framework that we are using is a structured decision-making framework, which uses a 5-step approach known as PROACT. So the first step is to identify, okay, what is our problem? What is our management issue at hand? The second step of this framework is to identify what our objectives are. So what do we ultimately value the most and what do we want to achieve? The third step is what I'm going to get you guys to help me out with, is identifying what alternatives do we want to consider in this framework. So again, here, trying to figure out which management options are available, which ones might be acceptable. The fourth step is to identify what our consequences are. So here we're looking at how will each option achieve each of our objectives. So how well will each deer management technique achieve each of our objectives that we set? And the last step of this framework is to identify what our trade-offs are. So are there objectives that we value more than others? And then how can that ultimately impact which deer management technique that this framework spits out at the end? So that's a general overview about the framework itself. There's much more math that goes into it, but it gives you a good inclination that that's how we're going about doing that. And the framework itself incorporates input from experts. It's looking at input from community leaders, and it's also incorporating input from residents. So that input from residents is coming from a baseline questionnaire, and it's also coming from input that we're gathering at our info session. So you guys will have a chance this evening to provide some of that input. That'll come later on. Okay, so let's take a little 5-minute break. This one can be really quick. Again, I'm going to ask folks to put some questions in the chat and we'll try to see those. And I'm also going to try to unmute folks and they can ask questions on that end. Just give me just a second and I can get that ready. Plenty of them? Okay. So Tammy's saying we have a lot of folks saying that they have questions. Okay, so I'm going to do 2 questions from folks who are live on the chat, and then we'll go to a couple questions that we had in the chat itself. So let's grab some live ones here. Okay, everybody should be able to unmute if you have a question. Let's actually go to folks who have their hands raised. Let's see here.
Did you raise your hand?
Let's go to Lee Goodman.
Really, just a very basic question.
Sure.
We live in Mount Washington, and our house butts on about 3 acres, and we normally have about 5 or 6 deer in our yard every day. But I'm wondering what happens to those deer, because I never, ever, ever see dead deer, and clearly they must have some sort of a lifespan. And I also never see antlers that are shed. And I understand that they shed antlers every year. So what's happening to all these either dead deer or antlers?
Yep. So that's a really good question, and I'm happy that you asked that. So I'm going to address the shed antlers portion first. There is a really large community here in Baltimore City that looks for sheds in the springtime. So a lot of them are getting picked up by people, so you won't find one. But actually just today, my coworker and I found a shed that someone happened to miss. So they are out there. You just have to look a little hard on some of them that are left. But you also see a lot of our small mammals using them as a calcium resource. So you're looking at bones, and of course antlers are bones. But those squirrels and mice and rats, they'll take them with them and bring them to other hiding spots or sit there and gnaw them down to little nubs. So that's where we're seeing a lot of our shed antlers going. As for the deer themselves, in our urban settings, we're seeing them live anywhere from about 6 to all the way up to about 16 years old. So a lot of these deer are, existing on our landscape forever, in general. But then for the ones that do end up dying, you're seeing coyotes eating them. You're seeing feral cats eating their carcasses. We're having red foxes eating them as well. And of course, we see a lot of our scavenging birds. So vultures, crows, they can really deteriorate those carcasses pretty quickly. And then the bones that are left behind, again, those small mammals like squirrels and rats and mice, they're eating all the bones to use them as a source of calcium. So that's where we're seeing a lot of our deer go.
Thanks.
Yep, you're welcome. Okay, so let's see here. I got Linda and Jim Smith.
Thank you very much. We had a deer, a doe, with a severely broken front leg hiding in our neighborhood's property, our neighbor's property. And it could not make for itself. It was really in bad shape. I called the city and finally got to talk to someone knowledgeable who said that they could not do anything to the deer if the deer could stand up. And of course, the deer could stand up. They suggested calling the state, and I called the state, and they said they can't do anything if the deer can stand up.
Sure.
We probably need to examine that, particularly with them being hit by cars, and find something to do with the severely injured animals.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. So I used to work for the Georgia Department of Natural Resources down in Atlanta, Georgia, and they established an urban wildlife program that specifically addressed these types of issues, where they would go out and try to capture these animals and euthanize them humanely later on, or see if they're might be able to have a professional look at them from a distance, say they should be able to live with those 3 legs, or eventually just wait until they get to a point where they can no longer move. And that's not really what a lot of folks want to hear, but that is certainly something that at least the Georgia Department of Natural Resources looked at. It would be wonderful to see that type of program initiated here in the city of Baltimore. The limiting factor here, of course, being funding for that. And so I would think that would be a program that would have to be initiated by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. So that's where some of that could be addressed. But what you're seeing right now is just a limit in resources and being able to actually address those issues. But I'm glad that that's something that you're talking about, and you are not alone in that, in being concerned about the amount of injured animals that we see. Deer are pretty resilient creatures, so you'll see a lot of deer with 3 legs running around. So those do exist, and they are able to live in quite a few instances. So it's not always necessarily something that they won't be able to live through. But yeah, let's do one more question. Tammy's sliding the computer over to me with all the questions, so we're gonna do some of those here. Yeah, there's quite a few. Okay, let's see here. Someone asked, what areas are you targeting for this effort? And are some areas more populated than others? This might have came a little bit earlier in tonight's presentation, but the areas that we're working in are 7 parks, and those are ones like Druid Hill Park, Hamlin Park, Powder Mill Park, Gwynns Falls Lincoln Park, Moore's Run, Herring Run, and did I say Faring Bay Brook? There's 7 or 8 of them that we're working in. So those are the areas that we're working in right now. Hopefully we can expand the program out to other areas like Silburn Arboretum. Some other areas in North Baltimore are also having deer-related issues. So there's the possibility that we can eventually work up into those areas as well. So there are some areas that are more populated than others. So you might see zones that have access to other green spaces that are really close to the Baltimore County. So some of those deer are able to move to and from those green spaces. But in areas like Druid Hill, for instance, there's not a ton of green space that they can use to move out of. So oftentimes you'll see those ones really get dense pretty quickly. So that's what we're looking at for that. Let's put a little pause on questions for now. And we'll continue on with each of our deer management techniques that we are looking at and considering in our framework. So let me go ahead and mute folks again. Give me just a moment. Alrighty, so now we're getting into the meat and potatoes of tonight's presentation. So as I stated earlier, and you also saw in the baseline questionnaire, is that we're looking at 2 main categories of deer management techniques. Those, of course, being non-lethal options, which are ways that you can reduce deer-related impacts without actually harvesting deer. And then on the lethal side of things, you're looking at how can we reduce deer impacts by actually harvesting deer. So the focus of non-lethal options are to increase the amount of cohabitation or coexistence that we have with deer. And then our lethal options are focused on deer herd reduction. So as I stated earlier as well, we are looking at 9 non-lethal options in our framework, and then we have 3 lethal options. And these are based off of best management practices that I've been looking over for the last 2.5 years, and ones that we've, of course, been looking at since we began the program here in January. And I do want to note that with any lethal option that could potentially be used, there are certainly legal restrictions that apply both on a city level as well as a state level. So I want to detail one of those state level restrictions that we have. You currently need to be 450 feet away from an occupied structure. So any house, any apartment building, any store that is occupied by a human being, you need to be 450 feet away from that structure. Unless you have specific permission from the person who owns that structure in order to get a little bit closer out of that 450-foot range. But the map here on the left-hand side, this is Druid Hill Park. So in the green outline, that's the park boundary. And then all of the circles that you see around each of those homes, that's that 450-foot buffer. So what we wanted to see in general was, are there areas within some of these parks that have availability for any type of lethal control? So here, any area that isn't circled by one of those 450-foot buffers, that area could be used potentially for lethal control options. But that's just one of the restrictions that we have to think about when we talk about lethal options. So I want to first begin talking about all of the 9 non-lethal management techniques that we're looking at. And the first being here of habitat modification. In general, that's removing any type of habitat or limiting the amount of food resources or shelter that deer have available to them. And so on the costs, it's in a medium category and it depends greatly on scale. So let's say, for instance, in your backyard, you're just sick of deer coming in. You might be able to go out in your backyard with your tree lopper that you already have, go behind your garden shed that has a lot of brush behind it, and you can start to take out some of that brush. So you can do that at pretty low cost if you already have that tree lopper. Then you can really scale up the scale itself and look at something like getting the Department of Transportation out there to do roadside mowing, or perhaps Baltimore City Forestry Department going out and doing some habitat removal. When you look at that large scale end of habitat modification, you're looking at much, much more labor intensive. You're looking at having wear and tear on equipment. So you have to make sure that you think about all the costs on the large scale end. As for restrictions, there's pretty few restrictions, so we're not really looking at a lot with that. But use on that is typically very, very rare on doing habitat modification. And that, of course, being, we've seen deer-related impacts for years. So we see a lot of forest or brush that is no longer there anyway. So for the forest brush that is there and the habitat that is currently still there, a lot of folks are really hesitant on actually taking that out. So we want to make sure that we show that that sentiment is there, that folks want to keep that habitat around for other wildlife species to utilize. So that's why use of habitat modification has been rare in the past. Now, on the other side of that, we see habitat improvements. So in this case, we're trying to do restoration efforts. How can we improve the amount of vegetation that's available for deer to use as cover or food? And also, how can other wildlife use this space as well in some of the habitat that we're restoring onto the landscape? Cost for habitat improvement is typically pretty high, so we're looking at either putting in live tree plugs or plugs of herbaceous plants that we would purchase from a nursery or a greenhouse, and a lot of those are really expensive. And when we also think about maybe doing seed dispersal on the landscape, when we think about native plants that we would have to put on the landscape with seeds, those seeds are super, super costly, especially for forested plants. So cost on habitat improvement is normally really high. You also have very few restrictions for habitat improvement, which is great. But the only restrictions that could apply for habitat improvement is making sure that you aren't planting any non-native invasive plants that could become noxious. And then, of course, for previous use, you have the category of rare. And you might be wondering, well, Shane, why is habitat improvement rare when it's really a good thing to have on the landscape? And the reason why it's been rare in the past is because you already have an area of high deer populations. And when you provide these live tree plugs or herbaceous plants out here, or whenever these seeds start to sprout, deer are starting to nibble those off right away. So it makes it really difficult to get these plants to establish. So that's why it's been rare in the past. The next non-lethal option that we have is, of course, hazing. And no, we aren't going to get a bunch of frat boys to come out here and haze deer out in our forest, but this is trying to use any type of scare device or disturbance technique to keep deer away from certain areas. So in rural settings, we typically see hazing used in agriculture crop fields. And they use this picture here is of a sound cannon. So you can think of that being able to scare off deer, but in urban settings, we can't use those things because we'd have a lot of angry neighbors pounding on our doors. But on the small scale side of things, you can use, even getting a soup can, putting marbles or pennies in there and going out and shaking it as a loud sound device. As you see a deer come in your yard space or eating your hostage, you can go out there and scare it away. You can also look at things more passive. So you're looking at things more like a motion detecting sprinkler or hanging pie tins or mylar tape above a plant that is constantly getting eaten. And that can help scare or deter deer away from using those. One thing that you have to, of course, note is that a lot of these hazing techniques, deer get used to them very quickly. So you have to really start to run the gamut of all the different options and really switch things around quite often in order to have some effectiveness. The restrictions, firstly, let me talk about costs. The cost is medium, again, depending on the scale that you have. So if you're getting 15 motion detecting sprinklers, that could be quite costly. But if you're just using materials that you already have, it can be free. As for restrictions, there are some. You don't want to, of course, have anything that's going to be loud. There are ordinances against that here in Baltimore City. But you also might have restrictions in your community association. So sometimes you'll have bylaws stating that you can't have something unsightly in your lawn. So if you have something that could be considered unsightly, you might have some fines from your HOA. And as for previous use, this is occasionally used, and most of the time it's only being used by residents themselves. And we typically do not see this being used by municipalities on a large scale. The next option that we have, oops, our lights just went out. We're gonna wait for them to come back on here in just a second. There you go. All right. So the next one we're looking at is exclusion. So we're using any physical structure to keep deer away from a specific area or an object that we might deem valuable. So most instances we're talking about fencing, but you can also look at things like retaining walls. We can use thorny bushes in trying to surround a valuable plant with thorny bushes so that the deer can actually access that valuable plant. So any type of physical structure that you can use to keep deer away. Most instances, we're seeing costs in the high category. So when we think of fencing in particular, it can be really expensive once you start to factor in, hiring the contractor to come out there, how much labor are they having, and also thinking about the type of material that you have. So is it a wrought iron fence? Is it a wood fence? Is it a plastic fence? Those costs can add up really quickly when you start to think about all the different factors that go into it. And then we have some restrictions existing here in the city of Baltimore. We have fence restrictions where on the front side of residential fencing, it has to be 42 inches or less. And then on the side of your fencing, you can have it, I think it's up to 6 feet or 8 feet. I can't remember which one it is. So when we think about on the front side of our fencing that we have, deer are able to jump over 42 inches with no issue. So there are some restrictions that exist, and having some fencing come in here can make the efficacy of this go down a little bit. As for previous use, this is occasionally used, most of the time, of course, being used in residential areas, but we also see fencing going along our interstates where they're trying to keep deer from crossing our roads. So there is some instances where it can be used on a little bit larger scale. Then we're looking at repellents. So here we're trying to apply any granular or liquid product or homemade concoction to an area or a plant that you don't want them to access. So here I have cayenne pepper, which you can sprinkle over your plant, or you can spray your plants with commercially made products, such as this product that's here that is made by Liquid Fence, and it's deer and rabbit repellent. I've seen quite a few folks having success with that. But one thing that you want to note with these repelling techniques is that you have to constantly reapply it because the rain will wash them away. So if you're able to keep on top of it and reapply quite often, you might have a lot of good success with repellents. Now, costs can range a little bit. You have, let's say, for instance, that you have cayenne pepper in your spice rack already. That's not going to cost you a heck of a lot of money. But if you're having to go out and hire a contractor who's going to come through and spray your entire lawn with a deer repellent, that cost can add up pretty quickly. As for restrictions, there's usually fairly few restrictions that you faced, but you want to make sure that you are not having any toxic substances that are being spread out onto your lawn that are going to be toxic for deer, for pets, for children. You want to make sure that you are avoiding that at all costs. And then, of course, the use for this is typically pretty frequent. Most of the times it's being used on personal property, but we aren't seeing this a lot on larger scales on, an entire city-wide scale. Then we're looking at stop feeding, which is pretty self-explanatory. So you're essentially removing any type of food resources that people are putting out. So you're removing corn piles, you're removing any landscaping or garden plants that might be out there on the landscape. You're removing any bird seed that you have on the landscape as well. So the cost for removing any of those food resources is typically really low, of course, because you aren't buying those products anymore. Restrictions on this are few unless there's some law saying that you can, of course, you can feed wildlife, which do exist. And then previous use is occasional. So most of the time you'll see this only being used on like HOA property or community association property where they put in a bylaw saying that you cannot feed wildlife. So that's where you can start to see some stop feeding efforts. Then we also look at changing infrastructure. So here we're thinking about homes, roads, buildings, gas stations, and everything in between. So how can we adapt or install these man-made structures in order to help motorists or help keep deer safe on our roadways? So the cost for this is typically really high. When we think of construction projects happening, that takes millions of dollars to do. But on the smaller end of things, we might need to just put in some speed bumps or putting in temporary deer crossing signs during the rutting season when deer are constantly crossing a certain area in your neighborhood. But the costs in general are very high for these infrastructure changes. Restrictions, there are many restrictions. So here you're changing any of the roadways. So you want to make sure that you are following all DOT regulations, any state regulations that exist, and also federal regulations as well. And the use of infrastructure changes is really rare because of these two factors being with a high cost and a high restrictions legally. The next non-lethal option that we're looking at is education. So we're providing any informational programs or resources to residents, which can detail how you can minimize deer-related impacts that we're experiencing on our properties. The costs for these are really low. Oftentimes, resources like the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, they'll come out and give you these outreach presentations for free. So most instances, you're seeing these free of charge. As for restrictions, there's very few. Folks love to learn more about deer-related conflicts and how you can mitigate that. So we're not seeing any restrictions on that. And use of this is very frequent. So I know of so many different programs across the United States who do annual educational programs. And certainly even every month, some folks are giving out programs or educational programs. So it is frequently used. And then last but not least, you are looking at doing nothing. So here we're just taking a step back, leaving deer alone, letting nature kind of run its course. And the cost for this, of course, is low because you aren't initiating any type of management. But when we think of long-term costs for the city as a whole, there might be some costs that really start to add up, especially for folks who are experiencing damage every single year. Restrictions on this. There are few restrictions unless you're maliciously putting safety at risk for residents or motorists. And the use of this is fairly frequent. So up to this point in time, Baltimore has basically took the do nothing approach because they haven't had the funding resources to do otherwise. And in most municipalities that haven't had a deer management program, the do nothing approach has been frequently used for them. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and switch over to our lethal methods, and we have 3 of those. The first one that we're going to talk about is professional sharpshooting. This is where a community hires a professional organization who is specifically trained at harvesting deer with either firearms or archery equipment. And most instances we're using and leaning towards that firearm side of things. And when those organizations are coming in, they are shooting these deer either in the head or in the cervical area on the C1 and C2 vertebrae, which causes an instant kill with those animals. And the cost for these types of programs are typically pretty high. So Baltimore County, for instance, they have sharpshooting that occurs in 3 of their parks. And every single year, they're using about $60 grand in order to hire the United States Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Services Division. There are other deer cooperator programs out in the state of Maryland that can do sharpshooting, but most of the time folks are using wildlife services with the USDA. There are lots of restrictions. So we talked about those legal restrictions being 450 feet away from homes that are occupied or other structures that are occupied. We're thinking about having to jump through all the hoops that it takes to get extra permitting to actually go through and harvest more deer than what is typically allowed by state wildlife agencies. So you have all those different types of restrictions that exist. And the use for this is occasional. So some deer management programs throughout the United States will do this every single year. But on a smaller scale, you see a lot of community associations who simply cannot afford to do sharpshooting. So that's why it's in the occasional category. So the next option that we're looking at is controlled hunting. So this is where the city controls every aspect of a community sanctioned hunt. So who gets to be in here? When do they get to go out? Where do they get to go out? What kind of certification process do they have to go through? Are they going to have to go through background checks? They get to control every aspect of that hunt. And so the cost for this is in a medium category. So if you have your city staff that are helping to coordinate and organize these controlled hunts, or sometimes called managed hunts, it can be really expensive on the labor end for the city staff. But let's say that you have a controlled hunt program that is operated by volunteers. In that case, you don't have any costs really, unless you have charges for hunters that might want to apply for the lottery system, or there are some instances where you can see some costs start to sneak in a little bit. But if you're having volunteer programs, typically those are free or little cost for folks. As for restrictions, we're seeing, of course, a lot of the same restrictions existing. 450 feet away from structures, you have to have licensed individuals through the state of Maryland, and you have to hunt during state designated deer hunting seasons, and you have to, of course, follow all of the season bag limits that exist in your region. And the use on this is fairly occasional. We see some municipalities using this every single year, but a lot of programs and community associations and HOAs have a difficult time getting this stuff initiated. So that's why it's in the occasional category. And the last lethal option that we're looking at here is traditional hunting. So this is where you have hunting by licensed individuals during the state designated deer hunting seasons on property that they either own or property that they have permission to hunt on. And the same type of legal restrictions exist here, being 450 feet away, making sure that you're licensed, doing all that good stuff. The cost for this is low. So you're having folks going out recreationally. They aren't having to pay to go into their own backyards and do the hunting. But safety is the number one aspect here. And a lot of folks have traditionally not been super supportive of traditional hunting because they do not know who these people are that are out hunting near their neighbors. So typically they're really hesitant on that. So as I said, cost is low. Restrictions, there are some that you need to follow, and the use of this is rare because of safety concerns. But there is an opportunity to use that in the city of Baltimore. It would not be firearms. There is a firearms discharge ordinance through the police city ordinances that prevent you from using those, but you can use archery equipment on your own personal property. But you do have to make sure that that archery equipment is 18 inches or longer. And that's the equipment itself, not just the arrow. So make sure that you're up to date on all of those types of restrictions before you even attempt doing any traditional hunting on your property. So now you might be wondering, okay, Shane, that is not all of the management techniques that exist out in the United States. And that is very true, but there are certain restrictions for some of the other management techniques that are out there, and I'm going to detail why we aren't considering a few other management options. So the first one being providing feed. So this is an attempt to draw deer away from problem areas, but in an area where you already have high deer densities, increasing the amount of food that you are putting out there for deer to use, that can increase their survival probability, that can increase the amount of young that they have, and overall that just generally increases the population potential. The second one that we're looking at is relocation, or not looking at in this instance, but I do want to talk about it, is relocation. This option is not legal in the state of Maryland at this time, and for good reason. Relocation involves bringing a biological creature to a different area. And when I say biological creature, we have viruses in us, we have bacteria, viruses, parasites that use us. So let's say, for instance, that we have a deer that has chronic wasting disease or another disease for that matter. You bring that individual to another healthy population. We are then responsible for introducing a disease into another healthy population, which is something that is typically not tolerated, and that is why it's currently illegal in the state of Maryland. The next one is the most common one that I see folks asking about, and that is fertility control or contraceptives. So here, this involves us actually capturing an animal or sedating an animal and either neutering them, making them completely infertile, or giving them a dose of some drug that will make them not have fawns either 1 year out or perhaps 1 to 3 years. Depends on some of the research that you look at. With this fertility control, there are tons of considerations that we need to think about. Of course, it being illegal in the state of Maryland, unless you have a research permit and a research project, you can potentially use it. This costs anywhere from about $300 to about $1,200 per deer. So when we're thinking about Druid Hill Park, for instance, we counted 115 deer that were in this park. When we think about $300 to $1,200 per deer, those costs add up super quickly. And it's also really difficult to actually apply fertility control or contraceptives to something called an open population. So we have a closed population and an open population. Closed populations are where there are no deer that are getting in or out of that population. So think of a population of deer that are on an island. They're not going anywhere. So it's easy to do it in those types of environments because you can actually apply it to every single deer that's there. Now with our open populations, we're looking at deer that are either able to get out, but we're also looking at deer that are able to get in. And the deer that are able to get in is the focus of this topic here. When you apply fertility control or contraceptives to that population that's there, you might be able to cover them all, and you'd have a really hard time doing it with the high deer densities that we have. But you're going to have those other deer that sneak in from other populations. So you're going to have the ability to continuously increase the population that you already have in that park as deer come from external areas. You also see it very difficult to have these populations start to decrease because it takes 10 or 12 years for that population to actually start to decrease. And you have to apply these drugs either every year or every 1 to 3 years, depending on what drug that you're using. Currently, the only approved contraceptive drugs that are out there are a drug known as PZP and one known as Gonacon. And those ones you have to apply every single year. And you also have to mark those individuals that you've already applied the drug to so you don't give them too much of a dose. And then it's also a question of, have we done every single deer in the population? And then the following year, it's like, have you applied that drug last year, or is this another deer that came in from Baltimore County? So there's tons of things that we need to think about and consider or not consider in this instance of why we're not doing fertility control. So I hope that gives you a good inclination of why we aren't looking at that. The next one I want to talk about is predatory introduction. So this is currently illegal as well in the state of Maryland. And this involves bringing in a predator. So we're looking at things that might have historically been here, like bears or mountain lions or red wolves. Of course, red wolves aren't around anymore and their population is doing really, really crappy. But let's say, for instance, we reintroduce black bears into Druid Hill Park. That would put safety risks through the roof. So we are not going to be doing that anytime soon. So the second to last one here that I'm going to mention is capture and kill. This involves you actually getting that animal sedated and then using a bolt gun to euthanize that animal, or you have to capture this animal in something like a clover trap or a drop net. And then you either have to use sedatives to give them an overdose, or you have to use a bolt gun or another firearm to euthanize these animals. So that can be really stressful for animals when you capture them. And then also it's a question of, if we are using drugs in these animals, that meat is no longer able to be utilized by charitable organizations or other folks who may want to take that meat home with them. And the last technique that I'm going to look at here and explain why we aren't considering it in our framework is, of course, toxicants. So here you're thinking about a toxic chemical that you can give out to deer in order to kill that animal. And one really concerning aspect of this is, of course, it's illegal, but you have to think about, you have other species that are utilizing areas that deer are in. You might be having other raccoons, squirrels, humans, pets that might get a chance to consume this toxicant. So it's really, really dangerous for us to utilize that. And there is no currently approved toxicant available in the United States. So that's why we aren't including these other management options. So keep that in mind. Now, we've gone through and detailed all of our 9 non-lethal options and our 3 lethal options, but I want to put this into context for you. Let's say that we are making a bowl of chili for dinner. We wouldn't want to just put in salt and pepper because that would be some bland chili. We want to put in other ingredients. We want to put in onion powder. We want to put in garlic powder. We want to put in jalapenos, and you name it. We want to put in all these different types of ingredients in order to make the best chili possible. So the same thing applies for deer management. We want to apply multiple different management options to make the best management approach. So when we think about deer management here in the city of Baltimore, we want to think about how can we combine these two in order to really complement each other and find the best results possible. So that's something that we're going to be considering as we continue to get our program established. Okay, so now comes the time where you guys are going to get a chance to provide input to the acceptability of management options. So I want to go through a few things first that are involved with that. The questionnaire that we're going to give you access to, and don't take the questionnaire quite yet. I want to explain why we're doing this. We're asking questions that are asking for demographic type questions. So we're asking things like your gender, your ethnicity, your education level, and a couple other questions that are scattered in there. And the reason why that we are asking those questions is we want to A, know how representative our sample is of the city of Baltimore. So we can look at the census data that's available online, and we can look at our data and see, do they compare? Are we getting a representative sample? We can also use this data. So when someone approaches me, let's say 4 years down the road, and they ask Shane, who are the folks who responded to this questionnaire? I can say, okay, we had 80% of our respondents were males, or we had 25% of our respondents were, had an education level of a master's degree or higher. So we can use these in order to tell them who our respondents were. Of course, this wouldn't be identifiable information. I'm not giving them your phone number. So we're not doing that. But the big portion of this questionnaire is asking how much do you support each of our management techniques that we are considering, and how effective do you believe each of those techniques to be? So use the education that we provided here this evening in order to apply your responses. And the last part that we have coming up are some focus groups, which will be around the late August timeframe. But we need to make sure that we have folks put into certain park groups because we're going to make management recommendations for parks specific areas. So we're looking for your address, and that is simply to assign you to a specific park group, a specific focus group for a park. And we want to make sure that, if you live only, let's say 2 blocks away from Druid Hill Park, we want to make sure that you're going to the focus group for Druid Hill Park. And for folks who aren't necessarily close to one of the 8 parks that we're working in, I still want to give you a focus group that you can come to as well. So any folks who are a half mile or larger away from our 7 or 8 designated parks, you guys are going to be put into our general category, and we'll have a general focus groups for those folks. So your address is only going to be used to put you in a specific focus group if you're interested in coming to one of those. And I also use your address to put your data to that specific park as well. So that deals with that. I'm not going to come knocking on your door. I don't care about coming to your door and seeing where you live. The last thing that we're asking about is your either phone number or your email address. And that is simply to give you the location of our venue for the focus group. That's to give you the dates of it, time that we're having it. So I'm just going to send out some reminders about our focus groups through that information. So at this time, you can feel free to scan the QR code that's there, plug in the URL to your browser, and just so you all know, the access code here is Dear Baltimore, and that's at the top in gold text here. And I am also going to grab the link to it. Give me just a moment on that. Copy the link. And I'm going to post that in our chat so folks can grab it that way if you're not able to grab your phone and scan the QR code. Okay, so please let me know if everybody's able to either scan it or access it through that link. And it should be open for folks. As we're going through this, let's give folks. Some folks are saying that the QR code does work for them, which is good. Other folks saying that it doesn't. For the folks who aren't able to get the access code or the QR code to work, use the link that's in the chat. Okay, sweet. Thank you for the folks saying that it works. Great. All right, so let's give folks a chance to settle into that. And your responses will automatically be sent to my data set that I have. And what we're going to do also, this is the last part of the presentation, so I of course want to thank everybody for coming out to tonight's presentation. We do have one more session that's happening tomorrow evening from 6:30 to 8 p.m. at the Faring Baybrook Rec Center. And I just saw in the chat that you guys needed an access code, and that access code is Dear Baltimore, and that's the gold text here that I have on. There you go. Yep, Mary put it in the group chat. Thank you, Mary. But if you have any questions at all, please reach out to our program. This is our email address here. That is dear.program@baltimorecity.gov. But at this time, as you guys are going through and doing this questionnaire, I will open it up to some questions. I know we won't be able to get through everyone's questions because Tammy had a lot that she already wrote down, but let me go into our settings and open it up to the floor.
Are you just taking chat or are you taking hand raises too?
I will do hand raises as well. So I'm trying to see if I can expand my screen so I can see everyone's hands that might be up. Okay. Let's see here. I'm gonna kind of go down the list here. Let's go back to Lee Goodman has his hand up. So Lee, do you have one last question?
If you stop sharing your screen, you can see everybody, Shane.
Okay.
No, I don't. You answered it already.
Okay, wonderful. Let me go back to the QR code just so we still have that available. I can also slide through our folks here. So going down the list again for me, Jacqueline Hill, did you still have a question? Alrighty, let's move to the next one on the list. Marianne Mears or Myers, maybe?
Mears.
Mears,
Yes.
okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah,
I hear you.
Right. And I also put my comment in the chat for everybody. But we're in Poplar Hill, and I've been trying to put up a deer fence and had to get a zoning variance, which took several months. And now that my neighbor wants to also get a zoning variance, we're really facing the catch-22 of the city zoning code, which is that if you want a variance, you have to prove that your property is unique. So the fact that all of us are afflicted by deer means that we're not eligible for zoning variances. And so I would really very much appreciate it if you would go to the city council and get the code amended so that people who want to put up deer fences can do it.
Okay, let me get that written down. Okay. Alrighty, I have that written down, and I will try to track that down, see what kind of legislative process that has to go through. So I'm hoping that we can address some of that.
Here, you have your glasses on? Yes, you have to take your glasses on.
Okay, so let me go to the next raised hand here in the chat.
You can answer them.
Let's see here. I am looking at, let's see here. Oops.
Is this like a quiz to see if I listen to it?
No, it's
Habitat improvement.
Okay, so I am looking at Georgia Corso. Do you have a question? Oops, sorry, Georgia. I think you're muted.
It keeps lowering my hand.
Sorry, Georgia. I still can't hear you. If you're able to turn your audio on, then I'll be able to your question. And depending if you're on a computer, Georgia, it'll be up at the top of your screen.
Okay.
There you go.
The birth control, won't the male bucks realize that the does that have been treated with the medication are not interested, you know? It seems to me it's a very expensive, and as a taxpayer, I am concerned about these expensive ways of taking care of this.
Sure.
You know, it's not going to work. I mean, it works in theory, but the bucks are going to know which does are in season and which ones aren't.
Yep. Yeah, so they would definitely know that, you know, one of them is in fact an estrus. So in that sense, the amount of bucks that are breeding does would go down, of course, because no longer you don't have any does coming into estrus. So you're correct in that. Yep.
And I mean, it's so you said it's like up to $1,500
Yeah,
per
1,200.
doe.
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
it's coming out of my pocket, right? It's
Yep, and
taxpayers.
it's currently illegal in the state. So that's an option that we aren't looking at this time. Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, Georgia, thank you. All right, let me go to the next hand that I have here. I have, let me see if I can get the name to pop up here. Norris Sidnor. Sorry if I butchered your last name. Okay.
That's okay. Yeah, so I live directly across the street from Leakin Park. I'm on Windsor Mill Road. And every evening I have 10, 12 deer in my backyard. They're not in my front yard because it's a highly traveled road right in front of my house, which is Windsor Mill Road. But early in the presentation, you mentioned that grass really wasn't part of their diet, but it seems like that's what they're in my backyard, just hanging out, just you know, eating the grass and killing whatever and leaving their waste. And you know, it seems like that's what they're doing back there. And the other thing is about the I guess you were talking about the lethal options, because I have a couple of guys that wanted to come back. I have a wooded area beyond my yard, and they wanted to come in with their bows. And they were talking about how when they shoot the deer, they don't kill them right away. I guess they run off and die elsewhere, and could potentially die in someone else's yard or what have you. And they wanted to see. I guess we would have to get permission from my fellow neighbors before they could do something like that. But those were my two issues and concerns and questions that I wanted to bring up.
Yep. Yeah, so let me talk about the first part. When you're seeing deer that are using what we see as lawn spaces or grass spaces, typically when they're going into those areas, they're going after the forbs or the clover that might be there, other large leaf plants that are also contained within that grass matrix. So it may look like they're eating grass, but most instances they're going after those forbs that are also in our lawn spaces. But they might get a few sprigs of grass. Say that again.
So if I was to possibly have the lawn treated with something that may kill that particular you know, whatever they're going after, that may you know, cut down on the traffic that I have in my yard.
Yep. But knowing how high the deer density is in Gwynns Falls, those deer are probably still going to move through the space anyway. But they may not sit there and forage as often as they are now.
Okay.
Yep. Now, as for the second concern that you had, you of course would need that permission from your other neighbors if injured deer were to go onto their property and pass away on their property. So that's a really big concern amongst a lot of folks. So if you're able to get permission from those folks, encourage them to perhaps let you go on their property and retrieve that animal. But with the hunters who've approached you, just make sure that they have permission from you, that they are 450 feet away from any of those structures that might be right next to your house. So just make sure that they're being very, very cautious about that.
Okay, yeah, I know they wanted to put some cameras, I guess, hunting cameras back there in the wooded area. But
Sure.
I'm glad I got that information. You said 450 feet, and also they have to use. You said 18 inches is the length for the
Yep.
I guess the bows. What?
Yeah, in the police ordinance that's there, it's specifically for reducing the amount of mini crossbows that we have in the city. But I think that 18 inches still is required for any compound bows as well. So yeah, that's there. But and also one thing that I wanted to note is just I'm not sure if those hunters that have been coming onto your property, if they're thinking about using the park space behind your area, but make sure that they are not going into the park and doing any hunting in the park. Make sure that they're staying on your property.
Yeah, no. The park is in front of my house. I mean, like literally direct. If I cross the street, I'm on the football fields.
Okay.
But the behind my house, I've got a nice sized yard, and then behind the yard, there's a wooded area which they hang out. I mean, they're back there, or they, like you said, they're passing through. We see them every evening. They hang out in the church parking lot. This entire area. I mean, if you know the Gwen Falls leaking, I'm sure that's why it's on your list.
Yep.
But my big concern is you're talking about you're doing a lot to control them in the parks. But I think once you have the control in the park, it seems like they're just going to push their way into the residential areas, which they're already here.
Yep.
So I'm just trying to figure out where this is going.
Yep. And you bring up a point that I should clarify. And if there's a lot of management going on in the park, it's not necessarily going to shift them out. On a daily basis, they're already moving back and forth between residential areas and to the park itself. So they're going to continue that type of behavior. And when we see that the deer density goes down in the park, that's going to essentially create a vacuum in the landscape where you're going to have a release from browsing pressure in this area. And after, a year or two, you might see more vegetation start to increase. So it increases the amount of food that's available for deer to use. So that's, of course, going to start to draw some deer in either from those residential areas, even though they're going to be moving back and forth all the time. But it could also draw deer from external areas from other green spaces that are close by. So I did want to note that as well.
Yeah, so should I be concerned with like the waste that's left in the yard, and as far as disease and I know the ticks are carrier as you mentioned for the Lyme disease, but what about the waste? Because I have a lot of their waste, and of course those areas that they're hitting, it seems like it's pretty much killing some of the areas in my lawn.
Yep. Yeah, you shouldn't need to worry about any deer diseases. Of course, don't go out there munching on deer feces, but there's really no diseases that you're going to be getting from the deer feces unless you're let's say for instance you're going out there clearing the feces out of your backyard, and then let's say that you cook your meals and you forget to wash your hands. You could have bacteria getting onto the food that you eat. So that would be the only thing that I would be concerned about at this point.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome. Thank you for your questions. Okay, so I see a few other folks that still have their hands raised, and let's see if there's other folks that I haven't had a chance to call on yet. Okay, nobody that I'm seeing here on that, but I still see Lee has his hand up. I'm seeing Josh. Let's see, Josh Neiman. I haven't heard from you, but you have your hand up. Josh, do you have a question?
So you touched on this a little bit, and I understand wanting to focus on the parks, but there are a lot of neighborhoods that have deer all the time. Lee lives around the corner from me in Mount Washington. I don't know him. He talked about it. There's a 5-acre parcel across the street from us. We routinely have 6, 8, 10 deer. The dogs don't care about them. They don't care about the dogs. There is a peaceful coexistence, but it is a ultimately uninhabitable one. Are you also going to focus on dealing with neighborhoods? And mine is not the only one. I heard Marianne talk about on Poplar Hill. I know people in Roland Park have the same issue. I know these aren't underserved neighborhoods, but we're still taxpayers like the underserved neighborhoods are, and need to have these needs addressed.
Yep. Yeah, so a lot of our parks are small enough where, as I stated earlier, they're moving back and forth anyway. So one deer that you might see in your backyard is also going to be the same deer that we're going to see using the park later on, maybe a few hours later. So in that sense, they're going to be moving back and forth, and there's going to be access for us to potentially harvest those animals later. But as for, us maybe using private property, if there's a large enough space, and let's say, for instance, that we are able to get the feedback from folks through this framework that lethal control options are chosen, let's say that happens. We might look to private property owners if they have permissions that they would allow us to utilize those spaces. That could potentially be a partnership that we'd be open to exploring. But in a lot of our neighborhoods that we see very limited forest areas, and we'd also have to make sure that we got permissions from all of the neighbors that might be near the tree stand that we'd be putting up.
I happen to be the head of the Mount Washington Improvement Association's Zoning and Land Use Committee.
Okay.
I would happily put you in touch with the owner of that property. It is a 5.5 acre parcel of property in Baltimore City that is mostly woods. There's a single family home on it. You could easily put up a deer stand in there, and if lethal methods are chosen, which I personally advocate, others may not, you could set up a deer stand and stand there and take care of a lot of the herd from that one property.
Sure. Well,
and Lee, that's where a lot of the antlers are too. If you want to go into those those woods one day, you'll find a bunch.
Sure. Sweet. Well, thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Shane, for this presentation.
Absolutely. And
could I ask one other question?
Yes, sir, Lee. Go ahead.
This might be a crazy thought, but there are oral contraceptive medications that could be added to food. Now, is it possible to actually feed the deer that is treated with oral contraceptive medication?
Do you know what contraceptive drug that is?
No, I don't know, but I would imagine there is some. I mean, if you can give it to humans, why can't you give it to a deer?
Yep. I'm not aware of any that are approved by the Environmental Protection Agency. So the only ones that I'm aware of are PZP and Gonacon, and those are ones that you would actually have to administer through a shot or a dart. Okay. So, of course, we're thinking about contraceptives that humans take, and you can take that orally. So there is the potential to have that done, but the research is not there, and there's no approval right now for a drug to do that. Okay. And just in thinking in general about this topic, you have corn piles that might be out there with this contraceptive drug out there with them. So you have to think about how much drug is the animal ingesting, and you have to figure out which of these animals have also ingested the drug in the first place. And are we having enough coverage in our population to know that we're having, effective contraceptive work occurring through that oral take-in of the drug? So that's something that we have to think about as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep.
They said, Shane, I'm responding.
Sorry, James, or Josh, sorry. You're
I want to respond to something to clarify again, because I said it clearly once. That statement was on my behalf. I said specifically I wasn't speaking on behalf of anybody from Mount Washington, but if somebody didn't hear me say that, I'm saying it again so everybody can hear that.
Sounds good. Thanks. Alrighty, so let me see if we have any other questions in our thing. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up. Does anyone else have any last minute questions?
I am. No.
Alrighty. Well, thank you all again for coming to this, and I hope to see you at some of our focus groups as well. All of the data that you guys have provided for this framework is integral for this thing to work, and we want to make sure that we're making well-informed decisions for each of the parks that we're focusing on with our deer management program. So again, thank you so much for coming this evening, and I hope each of you have a great evening.